Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we bridge academics and practical marketing. Every other week, we go deep behind the science of some of America's most successful brands. I'm Michael Aaron Schlicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today, we're sitting with Gareth Harvey, a chartered psychologist, a director of consumer psychology at Decide, the UK's oldest creative agency. Let's get into it. So Gareth, welcome to Behavioral Science for Brands. Richard and I have made it our little mission to be on the hunt for the best applications of behavioral science in the world. And we are talking to folks in the industry, people who share a passion like us for this practice. And we were so looking forward to our conversation with you today. So if you'll indulge me, I'll share just a little bit of your background with our listeners, correct build, and we'll go from there. So your current role is the Director of Consumer Psychology at Decide. At Decide, I've heard you talk about how you advise clients on optimizing their marketing strategies using principles of behavioral science and also setting up your own tests in market to support those clients. Before that, you were an associate professor and lecturer at a number of universities. And I've enjoyed listening to you talk about supermarket design, eye tracking, how consumers find items on the shelf. This is going to give us a lot to talk about today. So as we get into it, our listeners love stories. Maybe you could tell us a little bit, when did you first hear of the concept of consumer psychology, of behavioral science? How did you get into this field in the first place?
So I kind of got into this field probably back somewhere in 2007-ish, I think. So I kind of started to do the way that most students do. I did an undergrad in business, sort of undergrad, masters, and I was that really annoying student. So someone would say something and I'd be like, why? So they'd say, if you want to grab consumers' attention, you need to do this. If you want someone to be able to learn your messages, you need to do that. If you want to understand how they decide, this is how it happens. And be like, okay, but why? And the answer suddenly to all these questions was, oh, that's psychology. So after about 4 years of studying, I thought, I've done the wrong subject. So I told my parents, it's like, yeah, that 4 years was wasted. And they were delighted by this. And luckily, at the university I was studying at in my master's, there was a lecturer or professor who specialized in consumer psychology. So Professor James Intrillagator. And rather than doing, shall we say, more traditional research, although he did a lot of that, he did a lot of consultancy for companies and spent a lot of time with Unilever and the such. And I thought, okay, went to chat with him and said, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to understand, how do people decide what's going on? So yeah, somewhere around 2002, 2007, 2008, I switched over and kind of abandoned the traditional marketing and did a PhD in consumer psychology, specializing in atmospherics, in effect. How does the lighting, the aroma, the music, all those things that people weren't aware of, how do they influence behavior? And ever since I started that, I've been kind of doing commercial work and building on it and trying to find experiments where I can test in real supermarkets, because it's lovely testing in a lab environment, lots of nice controlled things, but it's a little bit sterile. When we try and roll those things out in the lab, outside of the lab, it doesn't always work the way that the papers say it will. And that's what really excites me.
It's such an interesting story. Thanks for sharing it, because so much of finding excitement and interest in academia is like understanding the why behind it, but getting out into the world and applying it in real supermarkets with real brand is a different level of application than the great work that happens when you write a paper and you publish results. But taking it to that next level, it's certainly got to be exciting.
Well, what really surprised me is most academics aren't excited by that. Their systems, their incentives are to publish papers. And actually, they design the most beautiful experiments that work in a controlled environment. But they've achieved their objective. Not all of them, but a lot of them, they don't want to. They're not interested in trying to take it into the real world. Whereas for me, I'm smug when I walk around a supermarket and like, oh yeah, I did that. That's my work. I can actually see it. And I kind of joke, it's a bit of a game. It's a virtual 3D chess where how can I influence people without them noticing? That's what really excites me. And going through and trying to work out what studies in the lab setting have a chance at replicating. We're talking about maybe 10% will, and it's trying to work out which ones will and testing it before we get there.
And are there any lab studies that you've seen recently or that stand out that haven't replicated when you've taken them from that academic setting to the supermarket?
The classic one is not one I did, and it's one where they did the lab study and then they tried to recreate it and they did a fantastic job. And it was looking at the food nutrition labels in France. So there are 4 different sorts. So we've got the ones which are telling you sort of A, B, C, and D. There's some where they've got bar charts, some where they've got numbers. And they tested in a lab setting and they tried to work out which one worked. And in effect, they gave people a catalogue. So they gave people a catalogue, they had to select what food they were doing, and they had about 3,500 products, but each one had those Nutri-scores on. They found out the one system worked. They then replicated it, I think it was 20 supermarkets across France. 10 had them on, 10 were controlled, and they tested different ones on different products. And they got the same result, but the effect size of that experiment was 17 times smaller in the lab. And it's suddenly a huge case of like, when you're making public policy decisions based on what you think of these lab-based studies are showing, a 17 times and a smaller effect size is huge. If you're a commercial organization rolling something out and you were expecting a certain return on investment, you're never going to get that. And that's a terrifying thing for retailers.
Yes, having an effect is not enough. It's got to be cost effective. And there are many things, if you reduce the impact by 17-fold, that are still going to be cost effective. So that's fascinating.
It's one of Pierre Charney's studies. But it's when you look at those sort of things, papers will publish things and they talk about it based on, it's a significant finding, P equals 0.01. But when they're so overpowered, it's very easy to find those effects. Actually, what we need to be more focused on is what those effect sizes are. Does it matter? And that's especially when we throw in extraneous variables like you've got a screaming toddler next to you, you're stressed, you're under time pressure. That suddenly reduces all of these things even further. And it's so important, this is why I love doing the field trials.
When you're advising clients and you're looking for new studies or studies that you think would apply to the business case, how do you go about deciding, well, you know what, these are the ones that are worth testing in the real world and these aren't, given that there could be such a difference? Just how do you approach it, even if it varies?
That used to be the main role I had for one of the companies I worked for. It was basically reading all the literature and working out which ones actually look cool and worth trying. So the first thing you do is, actually, is it something that will apply to a bit broad set of the population? So many studies will focus and say like, oh yes, extroverts who are under the age of 30 will behave in a certain way. And it's like, great in a lab study, I can do that. But actually in a supermarket, I'm influencing trying to shift at a population level. So anything where we're kind of nailing into that level of detail, we kind of ignore. Then the next thing is actually going through the method and saying, okay, did that work? Is it the sort of thing where I don't see any obvious flaws? And then it goes down to look at the effect size. I'm not looking at medium effect size. I'm generally looking for large effect sizes. So we kind of ignore the p-value and it's large effect sizes, maybe medium at a push. If all those criteria are met, first thing I do is I'll recreate it in a lab. Just check, hey, if I create this stimuli, will it work in a lab? I might try 3 or 4 different versions, see if I can boost that effect size. Once I've got it there, we then actually roll it out into one small supermarket or a controlled one. Test it about that. So there's a number of supermarkets I used to work with quite closely. We'd test it in that one, and then we'd look at rolling it out maybe across a county in the UK or a canton in Switzerland. If we got it at that level, then we'd go to a national rollout. But it took us maybe 6 or 7 different studies before we'd actually roll it out. So a great one is looking at different aromas in stores. We found the study, we found different aromas, looking at chocolate. We got the intensity we wanted in the lab setting. I think that took us about 7 different variations, and trying about where we put it. So there was no point in putting the smell of chocolate in the chocolate aisle because actually you've got a giant wall of chocolate. That's a fairly big cue to make you, to prime you. You want to put it on the door as you enter the store because, oh yeah, kind of fancy the idea of some chocolate today. It's something they weren't thinking about. We're playing around with that intensity levels. We want it to be something where if I tell you, oh, can you smell chocolate? Oh yeah, I notice it. But if it was a case of it wasn't in your face. We're trying to get that balance correct. So we try around that, and then we tried it across, supermarket in North Yorkshire. Tried it getting that intensity because the doors keep opening. Oh, okay, that's washing away that smell. How do we play it? To where do we move it? So we played across that, got it working in that one supermarket before it ended up being rolled out across all stores for one brand in Australia and South Africa.
It's fascinating. Is it fair to summarize that your approach, it starts with the academic study, then a lab study, then one store, then multiple stores, and so you're continuing to validate where possible what you're learning and test against it?
Assuming the client has my dream budget, that is the approach we're going for.
Got it. That's the recommended approach.
Yeah, each stage it's a case of learning. What did they do? Okay, how do we make it better? Is the effect falling more than we're expecting? Is there some extraneous variables we need to be aware of? So it's all about trying to play around with those sort of things and working out what tweaks do we need to make for the next study.
Brilliant. One of the things that we always like to chat about on behavioural science with brands is practical uses of behavioural science. And are there any examples of brands that have applied this field to great effect that you particularly admire?
So on the retail side of it, when we're looking at it, I think it's a really interesting one because supermarkets have become quite sterile in recent years. So accountants have got involved and they've suddenly stripped out all the emotion out of these sort of things. So if we go back to the first supermarkets, they were just warehouses. And then suddenly people realized, like, actually, shopping shouldn't be a chore. The more enjoyable it is, the more you go. And you had certain supermarkets, they did a great job, whereas they recreated the feel of a market. So in the UK, we have booths. And they do a lovely job because it feels like there's a delicatessen, there's a fishmonger. So they do this lovely story. But a lot of the supermarkets in recent years, we've just seen Tesco's, they've removed all of these sort of individual stores within a stores. We've got the data. We know people spend more when you kind of subdivide it because rather than feeling like you've spent 70 francs in one store, it's like, oh, I only spent like, I don't know, whatever is it, 12 francs in the boulangerie. Oh, I spent another one in the fishmongers. It changes the way you think about it. It's this mental you're compartmentalizing. Yeah, you know the word I'm nearly getting to.
Yeah.
You subdivide how you're spending that money, but we've actually had that taken away because it's more expensive for the stores. And that's a really interesting story, seeing which stores are still trying to create the atmospheric. They're trying to create this story. So I love seeing how they've done that.
I mean, that's a fascinating one because the idea of this compartmentalization, mental accounting, that's, a long-standing set of experiments would back up that principle. Why is it, do you think, businesses have ignored that? What's driven Tesco's and the like to remove those, meaning some businesses?
It's a really hard one to show on a balance sheet. So it's a straightforward case of all Tesco stores, as far as I'm aware in the UK anyway, they've done this way. So it's a case of they've not got experimental data to be able to show like, oh, when we've taken this away, we can see there's been a fall in overall spend. They can look at the club card data and see the individual receipts. They can see where people go, but we don't have a before and after. There's just no data to look at it. And it's a case of when they're under increasing pressure, as far as they see, they're just seeing it as a cost. They're not seeing it as a benefit. And that's a real challenge to play around with.
It occurs to me that we're always edging between eking out profit quarter by quarter to try to hit our goals and hit the business's needs, and creating enough meaningful evolution for the brand to actually make bigger strides forward. And that's it's not just a classic battle between CFO and CMO. It's also this idea of how much risk will a brand be willing to introduce into its model in order to get more advancement.
I think it's worse than that. It's not just the balance between CMO and CFO. It's within the brand manager with one section and another. I've done a project for some supermarkets, and I was a category manager from the one retailer. And we were able to demonstrate, I think it was a 7% uplift in sales. They refuse to share that research with other parts of the organization because their performance is measured on what uplift in sales they get versus the rest of that store. So we did this research, really proud of it, quite smug if I'm honest. And then about 4 months later, the same supermarket, same client approached us to ask, they said, can you replicate the project that you did over there? And it's like, yes. Could you not just borrow it? I will do it again for you, but NDAs are things, okay, can you not ask them to share? And they're like, they were checked. So they paid to have the same project done again, just because they wouldn't share internally. And I'd love to tell you that's a one-off. it has happened numerous times across different stores.
The bigger takeaway for our leaders that are listening is, do we have the right incentives set up for our staff to create the conditions for knowledge share and the incentivization to help the overall company win, not just individual departments to win?
Don't incentivize one thing and then expect a completely different result. I think that's a fascinating area.
It's an obvious one, but the idea, yes, competition drives things, but it also hinders sharing. And actually, that's fine to a certain extent, but when you are paying external people to come in and conduct research and find what works, and they refuse to share it, that's a real worry.
So the closing down of some of these shops within a shop is an example of a retailer misapplying ideas from psychology. Are there any areas within retail where you've seen someone very positively applying a psychological or behavioral science principle?
So the other one I go for there is Booths. It's a classic example. And so if you're not familiar with Booths, they are one of the more upmarket supermarkets in the UK. It's more of a northern one, kind of comparable to Waitrose if you're in the south of England. And they take you on, most of the stores, an emotional journey. And we always talk about mood being so important. So often you kind of say retail therapy, you're in a bad mood, I'll buy something to cheer myself up. Actually, the data doesn't quite back that up. Generally speaking, when people are in a positive mood, you spend about 12% more. So if you're in a bad mood, you might buy yourself a box of chocolates, bottle of wine or something, but you buy one specific item. If you're actually in a good mood, you just spend globally more, which is a really important thing to look at. Booths, it's an enjoyable experience. It does feel a bit like a delicatessen. It's actually the atmospherics. It's all focused on the consumer experience. Yes, they're slightly higher end products. There is a price premium for it, but they have this experience where the customer comes first. The other thing I like is it is a bit of a journey. If everything is unduly positive in the entire store, you kind of become accustomed to it. You normalize it and you don't really notice it. You've got to have these highs and, I'm not going to say lows, but more normal parts for you to actually suddenly get to, whether it's in my case, the boulangerie, or you get to the bakery and you suddenly realize, oh, right, I'm going for it. You need to have those highs and lows because otherwise everything just feels normal.
That's interesting. So that's almost like a story arc for a classic novel. You don't have everything at the same pitch all the way through. You have tribulations and then you have achievements. If someone just succeeds in a quite good way all the way through, it'd be the most boring novel you could imagine.
Yeah, it gets a bit of a challenge for the brands because where do you want it? You always want your brand to be on the really positive things. This idea of the misattribution of arousal or the emotional transfer theory, so like Zillerman's, is the idea that if it's in a really high point, those positive experiences get transferred over to that brand. It's why I used to do a lot of work coming up with the playlist of the music stores would play. We try to make sure, because if you play music, and it's pretty much a global phenomenon, music's in a major key sounds more positive. If you've got music in a minor key, it sounds more negative. We use this in lab-based studies to induce moods. We use it in retailers to make sure we don't have too many songs in a minor key when we play. I'll also think very carefully about the tempo of music selected. So, for example, higher tempo music, more energy. Generally speaking, that gives us more impulse purchases. Lower tempo music, they'll walk slower, they see more, but they're not going to make as many impulse purchases. So we're trying to get that sweet spot there, somewhere in the middle.
I love that. I think that particularly the point about the minor and the major key inducing positive or negative mood. I've done some work last year, maybe year before, with Chris Davies and News UK, and we showed a group of people, so 800 plus, some promotional ads. So it might be, pizza for £10 or a bottle of wine for a well-known brand for £5. And then we asked them to rate how good value they thought the deal was. And then later on, we asked them whether what mood they're in: positive, negative, happy, sad, relaxed, stressed, all that type of stuff. And what we found is that when people were in a negative mood, 60% of them thought the offers and promotions were good or great value. Whereas when they were in a positive mood, that number went up to 76%. So you get this 26% improvement in valuation of exactly the same offer if someone was in a positive mood. So I hadn't ever thought of music as being one of the tools you could induce that positivity about. I think that's a lovely idea. and one that could be applied by someone who runs a single mum and dad store all the way up to a Walmart or a Tesco's. That's absolutely lovely.
The other thing I'd say, special offers, promotions, they're probably one of my bugbears, shall we say. Supermarkets give away, it's hard to calculate. We think it's somewhere between 15 and 20% more margin than they need to. For the simple reason, supermarkets generally tell brands that if you want to be listed here, you're going to have to put a special offer for us. And it's a case of they don't really say what it's going to be because they know they're not paying for it. It's being imposed on the brands. Brands sort of panic and say, fine, we'll come up with something. And yet they have no clue what sort of offer works best in different situations. Could we use a buy one, get one free? We'll use that because it sounds good. People know what that is. 50% off, 50% more, buy two for £5. There are so many different mechanisms there. And half the time, when we've analysed the data, we can just sort of show that different offers will work in different situations. Some of the time, though, it's just having a benchmark or a sign on something on the shelf to grab people's attention to notice it. That's what is the mechanism that's at play. The other thing is trying to work out what's your objective. If you look at something and it's a price discount, a lot of the time people will just stock up. So the brand switching isn't, or the increase in sales is not caused by brand switching. Maybe 15% is. Most of it is people who would already buy that product. They'll just buy it, stock it up, and they'll save it for future. So it doesn't actually achieve anything particularly. If you look at buy one, get one frees, they really don't work particularly well on things like cakes or treats because people look at it, they'll notice it, but they may leave the second one, but it's free, but they're like, I really don't want, or I do want to have 2 chocolate bars in the house, but I'm not going to be able to cope with it. I will eat them straight away. So they end up leaving it. So if you're selling bleach, buy one, get one free is a great mechanism. Selling cakes and treats, less so. So there's so much here we can play around with.
It's fascinating. And applying, thinking about the types of offers based on the type of consumable that people are buying makes all the sense in the world. Have you created some simple rules or some simple applications? So the one that you started with here makes clear to me something that may get consumed quickly or be more of indulgence. Getting an extra one free may not be as exciting as being able to stock up on bleach. Any other rules like that in your mind, just a general rules of thumb that people can think about?
The first thing to think about is, it comes back to the most basic tenet of behavioral science, prospect theory. Losses loom larger than gains. We all know that. Yet we tend, when it comes to creating a special offer or promotion, we get that wrong all the time. So for example, sign up to our club card today and get 15% off. That's how it's always phrased. Just flip it on its head. Don't sign up today. Your shopping's going to cost us 15% more. And it's like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to be doing that one. So it changes how people think about it. Likewise, when it comes to what works, is it 15% off, I'm saving money, or 15% more? It's all about framing it in terms of where prospect theory comes from. And it's something most marketers are aware of, but you just don't think about it. So just bring it to mind whenever you're coming up with these things.
And I guess if you're going to mention losses, the other thing you could think about would be being much more clear about when the offer expires. Now, if it's going to expire in the next few days, making sure people know, because there might be an element of people think, I don't want to go through the pain of paying for that today. I might get it next week.
We've done something a little bit different with that. So yes, say it's got a set date, but if it's, say, 10% off, don't have a hard deadline on it. So 10% off, once it ends, okay, maybe for the next week have 7% off and actually have this tiered one. Because what you find out is when you have that hard deadline, people who come in later and didn't realize it was an offer, they look at it like, for God's sake, they get really annoyed. And then it's a variation of reactance, so they avoid buying the product. Whereas if you have this tiered ending, we actually find that sales end up increasing overall because at the end of the offer, you've still got people who will continue buying it. Whereas with a hard offer, people get, let's be polite, cheesed off that they missed it, and then they boycott the brand.
Yeah. So you might either want, as you say, a tiered offer, or make sure whenever the offer expires, you expunge all mention of it from the store, because I think that point of the irritation of paying more than others have done previously would be terrible.
We tested that, and even actually we found it was much better to actually have it go. I think we went from 15, 10, 7, and 5. And what we actually did, we finished the offer slightly early. So it wasn't that the offer ran for longer. We just gradually declined it from, I think it was a week, 5 days, 2 days, and we went that way. And that was better than just getting it because other customers mentioned it to each other. People remembered and things. So, people talk.
And just a clarity point on that, Gareth, was the entire offer plan made aware to the customers at the beginning?
Nope.
So they didn't know it was going to go down to 10, 7, 5. They just showed up and the number was lower and lower over the course of the time.
So we tried both ways. So yes, it was better when we did the 10, 5, 7, 1, 15, 10, 7. It was better when it was made public in advance, but it was still better having it when they didn't know than they're just having a hard end at 15 to 0.
So those are some lovely examples in retail of applying psychology to discounting and generation of positive mood. Outside of retail, outside of supermarkets, have you seen any particularly impressive examples of behavioural science in action?
So the first one I was going to talk about was actually kind of sticking with that high-end feature because, like I say, I design supermarket layouts. I love seeing technology in action and how things are changing. So in Switzerland, if you're into your avocados, they now have machines in Migros that tell you how ripe your avocado is, just so it goes from it. Not particularly behavioural sciencey, but if you're into your avocados, quite useful. But the one I want to talk about is actually robot shelf stackers. So there's a number of companies out there who have introduced these things. So Bossa Nova, Simba are doing these sort of things. And the idea is they are intended to make sure that all the products are on the shelf when they're meant to be, or from the consumer point of view, the labels are facing forwards. The behavioral science challenge for these brands is how do they interact with consumers? Because they're big, bulky things. Supermarket shelf is about somewhere between 6 foot, 6'5", 2 meters-ish, depending on where you are in the world. These things are moving around. And if a consumer sees them, they sort of like, I'm not sure what that is. They walk away from them, which ends up from being a revenue-saving approach for the supermarket as a negative one. I'm loving seeing how the design is to actually look at these things. So one of the things we're kind of looking at with this is actually the shape of them. So in the supermarket, the big thing they're always concerned about is dominance. So if you look at them, the height of the ceiling in a supermarket is generally quite high to make it feel not very claustrophobic. The width of the aisles is really wide, again, to make it feel more likely for you to explore. These robots are being designed so they narrow in. So it kind of gives the impression that they're narrower than they are. We'll look at the affordances, so it kind of has curves on them to look where they go. They've tried some really silly things like putting goggly eyes on them to humanize them. There have been examples where they've made them humanoids. They're just less functional. So, okay, we'll make them appear more friendly. So it's all about trying to look at where they go for them. We're playing around with ideas about what noises they make. Because if this machine moves next to you and you're like, I wasn't expecting it, it's off-putting. So is it like a high-pitched positive noise, sort of beep, beep, beep? They've tried around with more low-pitched ones, which again, people get really off-put because it's that negative noise, that beep, 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 that lorry reversing kind of a sound. So they're really playing around with some of the things they're looking at those sort of examples when they're playing around. And even the speed that they move at. It sounds a really obvious behavioral science question, but how quickly does it move? It's got to be predictable. They have to move in this logical way that it works with our human brain. The brain's a prediction machine. I need to know what this thing is going to do. So they're really looking at how they're going to be moving in this logical way. And the final question they've been talked about is, how do we frame or sell this to consumers? Because we're seeing more and more automation. It's taking away human jobs. So what do we feel when we see this? So some of them have got signs on them saying, I spot spills. I help keep you safe. They're trying to give that positive benefit to them. Others of them they're just telling you them with messages such as, and make your shopping easier. There's never going to be a product that's sold out. So it's all about how do you communicate this, because it saves the supermarkets a lot of money. But if shoppers don't react positively to them, we're going to be in a bit of a negative here.
Fascinating. What a fascinating set of challenges. When you're trying to advise the supermarkets on how to make this technology more amenable to consumers, where do you put what's the top 2 or 3 things that you're concerned about as a behavioral scientist and a consumer psychologist?
So we started to work on this probably about 10 years ago for the brands. And the first thing we did was the shape of them, because we had one of the concept ones delivered to us and it was like, oh God, that's huge. Because it was designed by an engineer. It was lots of hard edges. It was basically a 2 meter by, I don't know, something like 50 centimeters straight up. So the first thing we tried to do is, as soon as I see that, I can't see anything past it. It just blocks the viewer down the rest of the aisle. When we design supermarket shelves, we often place the target items, the things shoppers most want to buy, about a third of the way down the aisle. Because that means you can see it from the end, and you can see it down the end. It encourages you to walk down. If you walk down a third of the way, you're probably going to keep walking down the rest of the aisle. If I put it in the middle, you may not notice it from the end, so you don't go down. If I put it a quarter of the way down, you walk a quarter of the way down, and you go back to the edge of the aisle, the power aisle. So it defeats the whole point. If I had this big giant robot shelf stacker halfway down, I can't see anything beyond it. So it was a case of, can we smooth out the curves? How do we make it so the bottom needs to be that big? Because the center of gravity has to be there. That's where all the motors are. At the top, there's just a lot of sensors. So let's make it smoother, make it more human. Then let's see about trying to make it lean at a certain angle so it actually feels less claustrophobic. So that was the first thing we ended up playing around with. And then we played with the noise and the eyes. We wanted to make it feel less intimidating because no one wants to come up, I don't know, RoboCop down the aisle. It's not the image you're going for. Goggly eyes, it's childish. Children loved it. Suddenly it was a case of, it becomes fun. We changed the one we were working with from a metallic grey to a nice, fun, vibrant colour, because suddenly everyone was like, whoa, what's that? And again, it's all about, I wonder, whoa, what's that? Rather than I'm not sure what's going on here. So it was a really interesting one to change what's going on, how the people react to it.
And out of interest, what were the KPIs or the analytics you were looking at to tell how successful your tests were being? Was it interviews with people after they walked by, or is there something more quantitative you were using?
So as a psychologist, I don't generally like self-report measures because people have this annoying habit of lying to me. So it was a case of trying to work out, when we had them, we were measuring through CCTV and cameras, how many people were going down the aisles. Actually, we were comparing before and after to suddenly notice, is there going to be a decline? We were actually looking at straightforward sales data. If we had something here, were we seeing a decline in people buying things not just next to the robot, but let's say about 4 or 5 meters either side of it? So we're really interested in looking at those sales data.
Yeah, I love that because it's very easy to say, oh, well, we don't like self-report, but we're just going to have to do it because it's very hard to get metrics. But think about the problem creatively, that idea of, well, how often do people go down the aisle when the robot's there? That's a brilliant bit of observed data. So that's a lovely.
And it's also worth looking at what data you're collecting already. So the stores already had all the data to be able to track sales. Most major retailers will have some form of CCTV. That is now digital. So we can create heat maps from it. So we can create heat maps, we can create flow maps, so we know where people are moving. We can certainly see, actually, we're now seeing people are skipping this aisle, they're walking down to the next one. We have the existing data. So it made my life easier working with that data source rather than having to install my own cameras.
So we've talked a lot about the supermarket, but are there any areas outside of the supermarket we've seen behavioural science in action that you think others could learn from?
So one of the more interesting ones, we did some work recently, and it was with Boehringer Ingelheim. Now, you have probably never heard of them. I will be honest, I had never heard of them either. Yet they are the largest independent pharmaceutical company in the world. And they are huge. Huge amount of work on animal care, so pets, but also human ones. But I was really interested in working with the vet team there. And they've got some really interesting challenges, partly because in the EU, prescription drugs, you cannot advertise them direct to consumers. So all their marketing is going to the trade press. So we've got a B2B market here. So it's a pharmaceutical company marketing to vets. And they were trying to work out, well, what challenges have they got? And the problem they had was vets are experts at working out what's wrong with a dog. In some ways, you can say they're more skillful than a doctor because the dog will come in and it can't say, my stomach's hurting, my heart's hurting, whatever. All they're doing is just saying, it's a dog. But all their training has been in working out what's wrong with it. Suddenly they have to then convince the owner that you need to pay for this drug. Or more importantly, they need to convince the owner that they need to pay for a test. Now, if you're taking something like mitral valve disease, a really common disease in dogs, often this is detected when an owner brings in a dog for, let's say, vaccinations or something routine. As far as the owner is concerned, the dog is completely healthy. But suddenly they're like, oh, actually, we need to do an ultrasound. Now, an ultrasound is going to be costing a couple of £100, and they have to convince an owner to pay for something when they can't see anything wrong with it. So we've got cognitive dissonance going on. And the vets, they have no idea how to train them. So they suddenly, Boehringer Ingelheim worked out, we need to educate the vets. And some of the first things they had to do was change the language they spoke. And vets are constantly will use the language they're familiar with, as we all do. But suddenly they will be using these really technical language. And it was a case of the owner has just switches off. They don't understand it. They get intimidated by it. The other thing they suddenly worked out, they had to make sure they didn't go too far, because sometimes vets would use language which they thought it would be easier for people to understand, but people got the wrong impression. So they might say, oh, we detected your dog has a big heart. Oh, like, oh, yeah, it does. It's really nice. And it's like, oh, okay, that's not right. So we simplified it. It's like, okay, your dog has an enlarged heart. Okay. And it's trying to work out, well, how do we go around and change these sort of things? Working about going back to things like, well, we need to show them this. People don't quite understand it. So we would show them things like the CT scan. Now, no one has a clue what the CT shows, but it's a case of it's reassuring. It's providing them the evidence. And it's also talking about working out which order they've had these conversations. So when you're trying to persuade people, one of the worst things you can come across is something called the inoculation effect. So the inoculation effect is if you lead with a bad argument, people have this tendency to think that whatever comes next is also a bad argument. It's kind of a self-defense mechanism. And the problem you kind of had is sometimes the vets would start off and they were selling their health plans, because they'd be saying, oh, this medication, because it's a chronic condition, it's going to be expensive. They say, well, if you have this health plan or if you do this plan, whatever, we'll be able to help with your medication. And then they'd lead with the big thing. People were just switching off because they're like, okay, here comes the sales pitch. They're going with this. And even then they went with this big information that came next, they weren't really paying attention to it. So just getting them to think about the order they communicated was so important.
That's fascinating. I did a study a while ago where we created this fictitious brand.
Yeah.
So we mocked it up, looked beautiful, and it was called Black Sheep Vodka. And half the people, we said it was award-winning, refreshing, satisfactory, weak and vinegary.
Okay.
And the other half, we said it was vinegary, weak, satisfactory, refreshing and award-winning. And the group that heard the positive words first, they rated the beauty, the design, their perceived taste, say like 10 or 15% better than the people who heard the negative words first.
Yeah, so we've got that primacy and recency going around.
Yes.
But the other thing you've got to be careful here is you're talking about something their pride and joy. People, sometimes it feels like people love their pets more than they do their children. When you tell them the bad news, something really emotionally salient, you get into this attentional blink territory where it's a case of they switch off everything that comes next for the next couple of seconds. It's so emotionally overwhelming that they weren't remembering things as well. So if you told them really bad news, and it was a case of the vets were thinking that I've told them this, I've told them what they have to do, they just wouldn't remember that. So suddenly thinking about, okay, how do we structure this information? If you're giving this really big emotional news, just know that whatever comes next for the next minute or two, they're probably not going to remember. So it's thinking about how we structure that information there.
That's fascinating. What did you call that? Did you say emotional blink?
Attentional blink. So it comes from it's a visual saliency phenomenon from Jane Raymond originally. Jane Raymond and Kim Shapiro. And originally they were doing it with flashing stimuli. So you flash lots of words on the screen and you'll be told to look out for, let's say, I don't know, red, the word red. And you'd see it. You'd feel quite smug. But you would forget or you wouldn't notice any words that came after it, the next 3 or 4 words that came after it. The reason it's called the attentional blink is if the next word that came after it was a really emotionally salient, say your name, it's strong enough to jump out of this phenomenon known as the attentional blink. And emotional saliency things cause this blind spot in our memory. And when you're delivering bad news, like your dog might have a chronic condition, that's a real problem here. It's a case of trying to make sure that we know there's going to be this sort of pause in what we remember.
So with the inoculation effect, the recommendation of the vet is quite clear. Think about the merits of your argument and make sure the strongest goes first. With the attentional blink, what would you recommend that vets did differently?
A couple of things. One, first of all, you know you're going to be delivering these big emotional things. Just know that they're not going to remember that sort of thing. You've got that 2 minutes where actually this is the point where we're going to be telling them information which is we're being reassuring, we're being comforting. In many ways, we're just trying to be liked at this point, because if they like us, going back to Cialdini, they're more likely to actually hopefully pay attention to what comes next. After those sort of things, we're going to reassure them. But we had to make sure that information and the factual information we gave them multiple times. We would make sure it was done there. We'd also make sure the nurses or whoever was on the reception desk also gave them the information again. So we had that repetition was just so key. For certain predictable things like mitral valve disease, we had pieces of paper so they could take home and remember those sort of things, because having those instructions when you are a little bit calmer, it made life so much easier.
So helpful. So helpful. You know, part of what we do, Gareth, is we create show notes that folks can read more and do more research on the topics we talk about in the show. Maybe we can ask, Richard and I will collect it from you after, just it's a little bit more follow-up information that they can go and read. You reference some of the original work here. Maybe we can get that and share it along so people can learn more.
Yeah, I tell you, one of the other things I can do, when we were talking about special offers earlier, I've got a set of 15, 20 rules on how to run special offers, under which circumstances they work, when they don't, all linked back to, shall we say, they were all linked to academic research, but we've tried to make sure these are studies we've replicated so we can say, okay, we've got some data behind it that shows it makes a difference. So I can give you a link to that and we can try and share that.
That'd be lovely. I know we have lots of people that are always looking for things like this. That'd be lovely. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
No problems.
Richard, should we ask before we come to an end, you to give us a little summary of some of the key points of what we spoke about today? We had a wide-ranging discussion.
Yeah, very wide-ranging. But I think lots of interesting things. But if I had to pick three, I think the initial area we talked about was fascinating. So this is the idea that there is often a slippage between results you find in an experimental lab setting and then what works in the real world. So I think Gareth was positioning this brilliantly. It's not to just reject academic findings, but if you are a brand, take some academic findings as hypotheses and then make sure you're testing them in real world settings to make sure that there isn't a slippage in what we're looking to apply. So I thought that was fascinating. This mantra of make sure you're testing in the real world. The second bit, and maybe for selfish reasons, this is what I focused in when we were talking about tactics in retail environments, was about the power of positive moods. So I think, as Gareth mentioned, there's lots and lots of evidence that if people are in a good mood, they're less price sensitive, they're more likely to spend. And then his suggestion for brands to tap into that, retailers to tap into that, about playing music that's in the major key rather than minor key, I think is a lovely example because it's so easy to apply. And most people are playing music, make sure you use the one that puts them in a good mood.
The nice thing about that is it's a study which has been shown to replicate across cultures. So it's not one that's just tied to North America, Europe. It's been shown across Southeast Asia. It's been shown across Africa as well, because so many of our studies are weird, Western, educated, and so forth. That one appears not to be.
That's a real one with lots of support. And then I thought the third and final thing, well, I probably, the two bits about the vets that I thought were super interesting was this inoculation effect. The idea that if you open with a poor argument, it isn't just that argument that will be dismissed by the listener, it will negatively impact what follows. That was fascinating. And then that related area of the attentional blink, which was completely new to me, that if you deliver some bad news, don't expect people to remember what follows. So use the next minute or so for reassurance and general emotion comforting rather than continue to convey facts, and make sure that key points are repeated rather than just delivered once. So I think there was, lots and lots that we can take from that.
Gareth, before we come to a close, we always have a final question for our guests that we love to hear. You're welcome to extend beyond consumer psychology and behavioral science. What are you reading? What are you watching that's got your attention right now, that's enjoyable to you right now? What's an indulgence in your that's really been enjoyable for you?
It's going to sound really sad, but the outside of behavioral science, which is far too much of my reading, which is we're going to skip over, is The Economist. So The Economist, I find, is probably one of the best things because I can't keep up with the news. Trying to read a newspaper every day is something I just wouldn't be able to cope with. The Economist, whether it's the podcast or actually just reading the magazine newspaper, it comes out once a week. It's got the right balance of humor, the intellectual rigor, and I just like their outlook on the world. So it allows me to pretend that I know what's going on in the world, at least. So the podcast and the magazine.
Yeah, Richard and I are avid readers of The Economist, so it's funny that you mentioned that. We're in good company here.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the superiority of The Economist's journalism is becoming more and more pronounced as major national newspapers are losing advertising revenue to online providers. I think you can start to see the problems occurring. The journalism looks like it's being knocked out very quickly, whereas The Economist, because it has such a deep pocket because of the subscription revenue, the quality is as good as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
I think if you've ever read the Economist style guide as well, it's not just the quality of the research that goes into it, but it's the quality of the communication. So actually, if we talk about the behavioral science, it is written with one voice. At least in the magazine itself, they're all anonymous. There's no byline. And actually, you've got that one tone, that level of humor. And I really think that sets it apart from reading so many other newspapers.
I never considered that. Totally agreed. It is known in America as one of the only publications that does that, and it really makes a big statement. It's very cool. We want to say thank you to Gareth for all that you shared with us today. It was an amazing discussion. As we always do, we're going to wrap up all of our conversation on our website, theconsumerbehaviorlab.com. Show notes, links to the YouTube video, and all of your favorite streaming channels are there for our listeners. And until next time, Gareth, thank you for everything. Thanks for being with us. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
Thanks for tuning in.
No worries. It's good fun.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Method One. Method One is a team of modern marketers that practices the art and science of behavior change to fuel growth for indulgence brands. We do this by building interconnected marketing ecosystems that place the human experience at the center of brand building strategies across owned, earned, and paid media. To learn how to leverage behavioral science in your marketing or advertising, visit us at www.methodone.com.